Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Earthly Delights. Have you ever stepped into your garden with hope in your heart, only to feel defeated the moment your shovel hit the ground? Maybe your soil turns hard and cracked when the weather is dry, then suddenly becomes sticky, heavy, and exhausting after a good rain. Maybe you are someone who loves houseplants, tends a backyard garden after work, dreams of a more abundant homestead, or simply wants to grow healthy flowers and food without feeling like you are fighting the earth every step of the way. If that sounds like you, then today's conversation is going to feel like a breath of fresh air. Because for years, clay soil has been treated like the villain of the garden. People blame it for weak plants, poor drainage, slow growth, and endless frustration. You have probably heard the same advice over and over again, that heavy soil is bad soil, and that if your ground is full of clay, your dream garden will always be harder to build. But what if that story is completely wrong? What if the soil you have been cursing is not broken at all? What if the dense, stubborn ground beneath your feet is actually packed with hidden potential? The truth is, clay soil is not the enemy many gardeners think it is. In fact, when you understand how it works, it can become one of the richest, most resilient foundations your garden could ever have. In this video, we are going to look beneath the surface together. We will unpack the science in a simple way, clear up some of the most damaging myths in home gardening, and walk through 8 powerful lessons that can help you transform frustration into fertility. So take a deep breath, set down the idea that your soil is working against you, and let's begin a different kind of journey. One where we stop trying to conquer the earth and start learning how to work with it. And if you love honest, practical gardening wisdom that helps you grow with more confidence, be sure to subscribe to Earthly Delights so you do not miss what comes next. Part 1. The misunderstood marvel. What is clay, really? Before we can grow well in clay, we have to understand what it truly is. And I think this is where so many gardeners begin to change their relationship with the soil beneath their feet. Because once you understand clay, you stop seeing it as stubborn dirt, and you start seeing it as something far more remarkable. When we talk about soil texture, we are really talking about the size of mineral particles. Sand is the largest of the 3 main types, and you can feel that immediately. It is gritty, loose, and easy to recognize in your hand. Silt sits in the middle, softer and finer, almost silky when it is moist. But clay lives in a world of its own. Clay particles are incredibly small, so small that they are microscopic, measuring less than 0.002 millimeters across. In fact, to clearly see a single clay particle, you would need an electron microscope. Now here is where the story gets interesting. Sand grains are more rounded, with larger spaces between them. Clay particles, on the other hand, are flat, almost like tiny plates. And because they are so fine and so flat, they stack tightly together. That is why clay can feel dense, heavy, and difficult to work with. There is simply less room for air to move through. But that same tiny size is also what gives clay its hidden power. Because these particles are so small, the total surface area they create is enormous. A single gram of clay can have a surface area of several hundred square meters. Just think about that for a moment. In nature, surface area is where interaction happens. It is where water, minerals, microbes, and roots begin their quiet work together. So clay is not just plain dirt. It is an active, complex, living foundation. And once you see that, everything we talk about next begins to make a whole lot more sense. Part 2. The nutrient bank and the water reservoir. And that brings us to one of the greatest strengths of clay soil. If your garden has clay in it, you may be standing on far more wealth than you realize. Because clay is not poor soil by nature. In many ways, it is a nutrient bank and a water reservoir built right into your landscape. There is a scientific idea that helps explain this, and it is called cation exchange capacity, or CEC. Now, do not let the term scare you off, because the idea is actually simple. Those broad surfaces on tiny clay particles carry a negative electrical charge. And in the natural world, opposite charges attract. So clay acts like a microscopic magnet, pulling in and holding on to positively charged nutrients, which are called cations. These include some of the very elements your plants need most: calcium, magnesium, potassium, and ammonium. This is one of the reasons clay can be so fertile. While sandy soils often lose nutrients quickly after a heavy rain, clay holds on to them. It does not let everything wash away so easily. In practical terms, that means fertilizer and organic nutrients can stay available longer, right where roots can reach them. But clay does something else beautifully too. It holds water. The tiny spaces between clay particles retain moisture through capillary action, almost like a sponge holding water deep inside itself. So when the weather turns hot and dry, and lighter soils begin to fail, a healthy clay soil can still keep precious moisture lower down in the root zone. That reserve can make an enormous difference in the life of a plant. So the next time you feel frustrated by heavy ground, remember this: clay is not empty, and it is not useless. It is storing value all the time, holding nutrients, holding moisture, and quietly offering your plants a more resilient future. The challenge is not that the vault is empty. It is simply that most gardeners were never taught how to open it. Part 3. The concrete myth: why adding sand is a disaster. And once gardeners begin to understand that clay can hold both nutrients and moisture, the next question usually comes fast. If clay has so much potential, why does it still feel so difficult to work with? And that is where we run straight into one of the most common and damaging myths in home gardening. If you search for ways to fix clay soil, sooner or later you will come across the same advice: just add sand to loosen it up. It sounds logical at first. Sand feels loose, clay feels heavy, so naturally people assume mixing the two will create balance. But this is one of those ideas that sounds helpful until you understand the physics behind it. And once you do, you realize it can make the problem far worse. Here is what is really happening. Sand particles are larger and more rounded, while clay particles are extremely tiny and flat. When you add a small amount of sand into a large amount of clay, those microscopic clay particles slip into the spaces between the sand grains and pack everything together even more tightly. Instead of opening the soil, you bind it. The clay begins to act almost like a cementing agent. At that point, you are not creating soft garden loam. You are creating something much closer to low-grade concrete. This is why so many gardeners spend money, time, and physical effort hauling in sand, only to end up with ground that is harder, denser, and even more frustrating than before. The mistake is not just inconvenient, it can set your soil back badly. Now technically, yes, you could change the texture of clay with sand if you added an enormous amount of it. But we are not talking about a few bags from the garden center. To shift heavy clay toward a loam-like texture, you would need something in the range of 50 to 70% sand by total volume. For an average backyard, that means an overwhelming amount of material, far beyond what is practical, affordable, or realistic for most home gardeners. So let this be the point where we leave that myth behind for good. Put the sand down. Leave it for pathways, projects, or the beach. Because if we truly want to improve clay soil, we need to stop trying to force it into becoming something else and start learning what kind of care actually helps it thrive. Part 4. The tillage trap. Put down the rototiller. And once the sand myth falls apart, the next impulse is usually force. If we cannot dilute clay into submission, then maybe we can break it apart. So out comes the rototiller, roaring into the garden like a machine built for rescue. And I understand why people reach for it. Freshly tilled soil looks soft, loose, and beautiful for a little while. It gives the illusion that progress has finally been made. But with clay, that fluffy surface is often a very short-lived illusion. Healthy soil is not just a pile of particles sitting together by accident. It has structure. It has living architecture. Beneath the surface, fungal threads stretch through the soil. Microbes produce natural glues, and tiny organisms help bind mineral particles into stable aggregates. This is what gives soil its resilience. This is what allows roots, air, and water to move through it in a balanced way. When you till aggressively, you tear through that delicate system. You shatter fungal networks, disturb microbial life, and break apart the very structure the soil was trying to build. And in clay, there is another problem that is even more serious. As the tiller blades churn and smear the lower boundary of the work zone, they often create a compacted layer just beneath the loosened surface. This layer is known as hardpan, and once it forms, it becomes a barrier that roots struggle to penetrate. Water begins to collect above it instead of draining through. In effect, you create an underground bathtub. The next heavy rain fills that space, and suddenly your plants are sitting in soggy, oxygen-poor soil, unable to breathe properly. This is why so many gardens look improved right after tilling, then slowly decline into compaction, poor drainage, and weak root growth. The machine solves the surface appearance for a moment, while quietly damaging the deeper function of the soil. A wiser path is the one many natural growers have embraced for years. Less force, more understanding. Masanobu Fukuoka spoke beautifully about working with nature through minimal, thoughtful intervention rather than domination. And that is exactly the shift we need here. With clay soil, real improvement does not come from tearing the earth apart again and again. It comes from building it patiently, from the top down, in a way that supports life instead of disrupting it. Part 5. Nature's Glue, the Power of Organic Matter and Mulch. So now we come to the real turning point. If sand is not the answer, and force is not the answer, then how do we actually help clay become the kind of soil roots can thrive in? The answer is simpler, older, and wiser than most people expect. We feed the soil with the very thing all life depends on, organic matter. This is where compost, well-aged manure, leaf mold, and worm castings become some of the most valuable materials a gardener can use. These are not just soil amendments, they are invitations to life. When you spread organic matter over the surface of clay soil, you are feeding an entire hidden community beneath your feet. Bacteria begin to multiply. Fungi stretch outward. Microbial life wakes up and starts doing the quiet, transformative work that no machine can ever truly replace. And fungi, in particular, bring something extraordinary to the process. As they grow through the soil, they help produce a sticky protein called glomalin. This natural substance acts like a biological glue. It takes those tiny, tightly packed clay particles and begins binding them together into larger, more stable clusters called aggregates. That one change makes all the difference. Because once clay begins to aggregate, it no longer behaves like a dense, airless mass. It starts to develop structure. It starts to breathe. Well-aggregated clay has a completely different feel. Instead of being sticky and suffocating, it becomes rich, crumbly, and alive. Almost like moist chocolate cake in your hands. Those larger crumbs create wider spaces in the soil, known as macropores, and those spaces are what allow water to move more freely and roots to explore more deeply. In other words, organic matter does not fight clay. It teaches clay how to function beautifully. And here's the best part. You do not need to dig it in. In fact, it is often better not to. Simply lay 2 to 4 inches of rich compost right on top of the soil surface. Let gravity, rain, earthworms, microbes, and time carry that goodness downward naturally. Then protect it with a thick layer of mulch, wood chips, straw, shredded leaves, or whatever organic material makes sense for your garden. Mulch is not just decoration, it is protection. It shields the soil from pounding rain that can break apart delicate structure. It keeps temperatures more stable. It slows evaporation. It prevents the surface of clay from baking into a hard, cracked crust under the summer sun. And little by little, as that mulch breaks down, it continues feeding the system from above. This is how nature has always built soil. Forests do not till themselves. Meadows do not haul in sand. Year after year, leaves fall, stems collapse, roots die back, and the earth is renewed from the top down. When we add compost and mulch to clay, we are not inventing some clever gardening trick. We are simply following a pattern nature has been perfecting for ages. And once you begin working that way, the soil starts to respond with surprising generosity. Part 6. The Green Engineers, Clay-Busting Plants. And that naturally leads us to the next question. If we are no longer relying on rototillers to break into dense soil, then how do we loosen the deeper layers of clay where compaction can still be a problem? The answer is one of my favorite lessons in all of gardening. We let plants do the digging for us. Nature has already designed an underground workforce perfectly suited to this job. Instead of mechanical tillage, we can use biological tillage. Instead of steel blades cutting through the soil, we can send in roots, strong, living roots that open channels, feed microbes, and improve the ground from the inside out. One of the best examples is daikon radish, often called tillage radish for good reason. This plant sends down a thick, powerful taproot that can drive deep into compacted clay, sometimes reaching 2 feet below the surface. That root pushes through dense layers with remarkable force. Then, when the cold season arrives and the plant dies back, the root begins to decompose right where it grew. And what is left behind is incredibly valuable. A deep, natural tunnel lined with organic matter. That channel becomes a pathway for air, water, worms, and future roots to travel downward far more easily than before. Sunflowers can help in a similar way. Their strong taproots press into heavy ground, while the plant itself adds height, color, and life to the garden above. So even while they are doing serious work below the surface, they are also bringing beauty and energy to the space around them. Then there are the fibrous rooted builders, such as winter rye. These plants do not rely on one large root. Instead, they create dense, widespread root systems that press through the soil matrix from every direction. That mass of roots helps fracture compacted areas, improves aggregation, and adds a tremendous amount of organic carbon to the ground. The effect is powerful, not because it is sudden, but because it is thorough. Root by root, season by season, the soil becomes more open, more resilient, and more biologically active. This is one of the most elegant partnerships a gardener can make. You sow the seed, give the plants their moment to grow, and allow them to do the underground labor that machines often do poorly. It is quieter, gentler, and far more in tune with how healthy soil is actually built. And once you see plants not just as crops or flowers, but as engineers of the earth itself, you begin to understand that real soil restoration is not about domination. It is about cooperation. Part 7. Don't tread on me. Avoiding compaction. Now that we have begun rebuilding clay from the top down, there is one more truth we have to respect if we want that progress to last. Healthy structure is precious, and once you understand how hard the soil works to rebuild itself, you stop taking it for granted. That brings us to one of the simplest and most important rules in all of clay gardening. Never walk on it, and never work it when it is wet. This matters because clay behaves very differently when it is saturated. Those microscopic, plate-like particles we talked about earlier begin to lose friction when they are full of water. Instead of holding a loose, living structure, they start sliding and pressing flat against one another. The moment you step on wet clay with heavy boots, drag a cart across it, or push a loaded wheelbarrow over it, you squeeze the air right out of the soil. Pore spaces collapse, structure disappears. What was beginning to open and breathe becomes dense and sealed again. One careless pass over wet clay can undo a surprising amount of good work. And this is where patience becomes part of good gardening. Before you plant, dig, weed, or shape a bed, do a simple test with your own hands. Pick up a handful of soil and squeeze it. If it stays in a tight, sticky lump, or if you can press it into a smooth, shiny ribbon, it is still too wet. That is your sign to pause. Walk away for a while. Let the soil rest. Let it dry enough to crumble naturally in your hand. That one habit alone can save you from years of repeated compaction. It also helps to make your garden work with your feet instead of against them. Create permanent walking paths and clearly define growing beds so you always know where pressure belongs and where it does not. Raised beds can be especially helpful in clay landscapes because they give you a protected growing zone that never has to be stepped on. The paths take the wear, the beds stay loose, alive, and welcoming to roots. In a healthy garden, not every inch of ground should be treated the same way. Some spaces are meant for movement, and some are meant for growth. Once you accept that, the whole garden begins to function more wisely. Your beds stop being battlegrounds underfoot and start becoming protected sanctuaries where life can spread downward in peace. Part 8. Embracing the native flora. Plants that love clay. And after all of this, we arrive at one of the most freeing lessons of all. Yes, we can improve clay. Yes, we can protect it, feed it, and help it develop beautiful structure. But sometimes the smartest thing a gardener can do is even simpler than that. Instead of constantly trying to force the environment to suit the plant, choose plants that already know how to thrive in that environment. There are so many beautiful, resilient plants that do not merely tolerate clay soil, but actually enjoy the steady moisture and mineral richness it provides. Once you begin working with those plants, gardening feels lighter. It feels more cooperative. It feels as though the land itself is finally on your side. Think of some of the great native prairie perennials like black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers. These are strong, dependable plants with root systems that can handle heavier ground and even help improve it over time. Once established, they are wonderfully resilient through changing weather, and they manage the feast and famine rhythm of clay soil with impressive grace. They bring color, pollinators, and strength all at once. Then there is the daylily, a plant so often underestimated because it is so reliable. But reliability is a gift in the garden. Its thick roots push through dense ground, store moisture, and support bold blooms even when the surface soil seems dry and unforgiving. In shaded or damp areas where other plants may sulk, hostas can step in with lush, generous foliage because they appreciate the moisture clay tends to hold. And in sunnier, drier spots, sedums can spread with ease, proving that not every successful clay garden needs deep, fluffy loam to look alive and abundant. This is where gardening becomes joyful again. You stop trying to make every plant fit every place. You stop treating your soil like a flaw that must be corrected before beauty is possible. Instead, you begin matching the character of the land with the character of the plants. And when that match is right, the whole garden starts to feel less like a struggle and more like a symphony. Each plant knows its role. Each root finds its place. And the gardener is no longer forcing harmony, but simply helping it unfold. Conclusion: the paradigm shift. So now let us step back and take in the full picture together. At the beginning of this journey, clay may have looked like the obstacle standing between you and the garden you dreamed of. It felt heavy, stubborn, messy, and hard to manage. It seemed like the thing that had to be conquered before anything beautiful could grow. But now we can see it differently. Clay soil is not empty ground. It is a reservoir that holds life-giving moisture when other soils dry out too fast. It is a nutrient bank storing valuable elements your plants need in order to grow strong and steady. And when you begin caring for it in the right way, when you feed it with compost, cover it with mulch, let roots and microbes do the deep work, and protect it from compaction, it begins to transform. What once felt dense and discouraging becomes rich, structured, and deeply fertile. Not overnight, but faithfully, not through violence, but through partnership. And I think that is the real shift this kind of gardening invites us into. The problem was never the clay itself. The problem was the old idea that the earth has to be dominated before it can become productive. So many gardeners were taught to attack the soil, to force it, to break it, to override its nature. But the longer you garden, the more clearly you begin to see that the most lasting results rarely come from control. They come from understanding. What a relief it is to put down that old mindset. What a joy it is to realize that good gardening is not about fighting the land beneath your feet. It is about healing it, supporting it, and learning to see its strengths clearly enough to work with them. If this changed the way you see your soil today, make sure you subscribe to Earthly Delights and join me for more grounded, practical, nature-loving wisdom for gardeners who want to grow with confidence. And I would truly love to hear from you in the comments. What has been your biggest challenge with your soil? And which of these 8 steps are you most excited to try first? Until next time, keep your hands dirty, keep your heart open, and remember this: the earth is not against you. More often than not, it is quietly trying to help you. Happy gardening.